that people were coming, they're coming. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was dreaming. I jumped up and I seen Elian there and I just grabbed him in my arms and I went into the room to protect this little boy.
We were on the phone with them negotiating. They put us on hold, and while we were on hold, they banged on the door. They broke everything in. They came in with guns. When they came in, I stood in front of everybody and all my family was behind me. And I begged them, I beg you, please don't let the boy see the guns. Please, I'll give them to you. I told the lady that came in with a bag, with this bag, to stick them in the bag. Please, I looked at her eyes, please. He saw his mother's death because she's a mother. And she should know how that feels. Don't let him see me, I'll give you the boy. Give me the boy, give me the boy. She said, I'll give you the boy, don't let him see this, don't let him see this, please. We'll shoot you, we'll shoot you. We'll shoot, stand back, we'll shoot. They put a gun right there and they took him.
Mom was pointing right to me. Give me the boy, give me the boy. And there was a lady with a blanket. She took it and she put it over his face.
They threw a blanket over his head like they could suffocate the kid, and they just dragged him out of the house and they shoveled him into a truck here and then backed out of here. These people were negotiating with Jana Reno. This is the woman that said she wanted to be sensitive to little Elian.
The relationship between Fidel Castro and Dwayne Andrews started in 1995 over dinner in New York City. Dwayne knew at that time that he was going to be doing business in Cuba. In 1996, he told the Washington Post Sunday magazine in an article titled "The Player" that he's going down to see Castro and they're going to do business together. And he was told that, well, you can't do business directly in Cuba. He said, I'm going to build an alcohol plant there, but we're going to do it through a subsidiary in Spain. ADM put an alcohol plant in there in 1997. They planned this big food fair in the year 2000 in January. They had the governor of Illinois down to Cuba to speak, the University of Havana, and they had people from the Cuban interest section speak at ADM's board meeting in Decatur and the University of Illinois. And this is part of legitimizing basically illegal activities. Daniel Midland and their relationship with Castro. Young Elian Gonzalez got in the way. Castro said, I want him back. Dwayne Andrews said, we'll deliver. And that's just about the relationship that they have, is two dictators sitting down and said, what do you want? I'll give you something, you give me something. All the plays that were made in sending Elian back to Castro were typical of what we've seen in the past at ADM, including the whistleblower who recorded the crimes of this corporation and the family for 2.5 years. He's in prison serving 10 years for being the whistleblower. He ended up being the bad guy. The Gonzalez family and the Cuban exile community here became the scapegoat. We call Elian in our circle ADM sugar baby. He had to get Elian back to Castro. Believed that regardless who represented the Gonzalez family here in Miami, Elian was going back. I don't care if you had Johnny Cochran, Alan Dershowitz, and all the other top lawyers you can think of. This was laid in stone. The rule of law did not exist. It was the rule of the jungle. And that was very evident in the actions of our government.
In about 1995, I became interested in ADM because there was a flurry of news stories about how a young president of one of the ADM divisions has served as an informant to the government about a worldwide price-fixing conspiracy. I had written my first book about business and ethics, and it was largely a positive experience. I thought that this was a negative business story about business and the government and collusion, and I wanted to investigate it and see it through. I decided to write the book because it basically dealt with some of the questions in American society that I'm concerned with. Whether we really have democracy or whether companies, certain multinational corporations have become too influential, too powerful, and it seemed like a window on those types of situations. I would describe my book as an investigation of a very politically influential company that became so arrogant that eventually it got caught in a way that it could not get out of, and how the government responded. My question as a lawyer was, would the law be able to deal with this special interest, or would it be compromised? I very much wanted to see the answer, so I followed the case, and a lot of the book is about the various legal maneuvers of the company, the government's response to ADM, the legal proceedings, including a long white-collar trial. I started my research for the book in about 1996. I began by reading everything I could find out about ADM, including what had been written before by journalists, government records, and then I started going to court proceedings, mainly in the Midwest, in Chicago, and in other courts in Illinois. I think that the one thing that I probably did that a lot of journalists and writers don't do is that I really focused on the legal proceedings, court transcripts, court records, court hearings, things of that nature, because that's my background. And then I started to attempt to interview some of the individuals who were involved in the situation. ADM would not cooperate with my questions. Interestingly enough, at one point I became a shareholder of ADM's so that I could go to their annual meetings, and still they attempted to block me from going to an annual meeting after some of their executives had been convicted of felonies for price fixing. I was able to go to the meeting as the guest of a local journalist. At the door, they didn't realize who I was, so I went to the meeting anyhow. But they were completely resistant to me from the beginning. During the course of my research and my writing, there were threats made against me and my family. Frankly, I did not worry about them too much. They would come over the computer or over the telephone. Once I went to a book signing in Decatur, Illinois, where ADM is based, and somebody who came up to the table made a threat. It was in a public place. There were many people around. I did not take it particularly seriously. I also attempted to probe the government, which is very close to ADM, really intertwined with ADM. And some parts of the government were cooperative and some weren't. I still have not received a fair amount of the records that I requested under the Freedom of Information Act, which are not confidential records, which are not secret records, but they have not been provided to me.
We got involved with ADM because we were consultants in the agribusiness, also investors in Archer's Daniel Midland. And in 1995, ADM was busted for price fixing in 2 products, and 2 of our clients were involved, plus we also knew the whistleblower. And we started the ADM Shareholders Watch Committee at that time. And one thing led to another, and we stayed on top of it. And then we've been active ever since. The danger of corporations like Archer's Daniel Midland here in the United States is the rule of law is used against people that go up against them. They do not abide by the rule of law. Dwayne Andrews said when his firm got busted in 1995, I own the Justice Department. Well, we don't know if he owns it, but we know that he can rent it at any time he wants. Corporate crime cannot exist in this country without the help of government.
During the second half of the 20th century, with the possible exception of some of the major oil companies, ADM was the most politically influential company in the United States.
One of the things that's hard for Americans to accept is that we are a country of basically law-abiding people, but those that want to have their way do not abide by the law, and they don't have to because they have the ability through their connections of elected officials, the cash to hire powerful lawyers, that they are not held accountable. They do business through blackmail, intimidation, and most of all, donations. There's no bigger donor to elected officials than Dwayne Andrews and the Archer Daniel Midland Company. And that started in late 48, and he's been doing it ever since.
The chairman of ADM, who stepped down during the course of the scandal, a gentleman by the name of Dwayne Andrews, basically had been on very close, personally friendly terms with every American president since the 1950s. In addition, he had extremely close relations with other key people in government, including senators, members of Congress, officials in cabinet positions, ambassadors to the United Nations. All of these ties were very carefully cultivated by him and others in the company to an extent that really is extremely unusual, but was very highly profitable to the company and to some of the politicians involved.
The greatest threat to America is not weapons of mass destruction. It's corporations with weapons of destruction, of lying about their financials, doing business, not recording it, paying off elected officials so they can circumvent the law. And then when people stand up against them, they use the law to thump them real hard. They own judges, they own congressmen, senators, they have the best lawyers in Washington, and the lawyers in the Washington law firms formerly were with the Justice Department. They will get what they want from government. People say, well, the Democrats were in power, that's why this happened. Same thing would happen today. John Ashcroft would do just what Janet Reno did. He's bought and paid for it too. He was the biggest advocate of doing business with Cuba when he was running for re-election in his senatorial campaign. He received just shy of $400,000 from ADM and others. So this is the threat to our country is from within. It's not from without.
I think ADM is unique in some sense with regard to its power over the federal government, at least historically. I think ADM was a pioneer in terms of the use of soft money and PAC money to gain control over the federal government. I also think that it pioneered certain measures of what I would call anonymity by using trade groups, farmers groups, but they're basically straw men. They really don't exist except to help ADM with its goals, whether dealing with the sugar program, which is to prop up high fructose corn syrup, this enormous product of ADM's, ethanol, or various programs to export food and grain to other countries and have them guaranteed by the United States Treasury. ADM has been a very effective political player. So ADM was unique. Now certain other types of industries have learned from ADM, learned from its law firms and its lobbyists, and we see some of the same conduct in other industries such as telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, and the oil business. Dwayne Andrews became attuned to the idea of corporate welfare. With the use of his connections in government, he would be able to receive enormous payouts to his company until by the time of the worldwide price fixing scandal, which ADM got caught in the middle 1990s, ADM was the largest recipient of corporate welfare of any company in the United States. It's well known that many politicians inside Washington will do ADM's bidding. But they also pass out a lot of money to politicians in both parties and to both parties' political action committees. Carter's ambassador to Russia, who was Robert Strauss, who also was the head of the Democratic Party for a long time, did many favors, interceded on behalf of ADM with the government, and he ended up being placed on the ADM board and receiving a lot of legal work. There were a lot of arrangements like that. ADM is famous for them. Jimmy Carter was corrupted by ADM. ADM was able to get special favors out of the government with regard to tariff protection, particularly for ethanol, which is corn alcohol. And after Carter left office, they then bought his peanut farm for an above-market rate. A lot of the things that Carter did at the end of his term in favor of ADM were highly questionable. But like other politicians, after he left office, he profited. ADM puts its power to use by trying to figure out a market that it can dominate and control, perhaps monopolize, and by figuring out how it can combine with the government to achieve its potential in that market. For example, many people go to fill up their gas tanks and they see they're filling it up with gasoline with ethanol in it. And ethanol is a very questionable gasoline additive. It takes a lot of energy to produce the ethanol. In the first place, 72% more, as a matter of fact, according to one study, than it yields in gasoline. So how does ADM get that into gasoline, and how does it profit from it? Well, it gets an exemption from federal excise taxes, which is essentially a subsidy to the company. And it does that by lining up politicians on both sides of the aisle and having them support ethanol as a government program. If ADM did not have its extraordinary power, its extraordinary relationship with the government, it would not exist as the huge multinational company that it is. I'm aware of influence over all branches of government by ADM and of the application of this extraordinary power over legislators, members of Congress, the executive branch, up to the president, and including people in regulatory agencies, administrative agencies. And watching the ADM legal proceedings, I came to be aware of great influence over courts and over the United States Department of Justice. The ethics of ADM, I think, were proven to be poor in the 90s. What came out in the investigation and the trial that are at the heart of my book is that ADM had a very cynical and callous view about our federal laws against monopolies, against price fixing markets. Probably had been feeling that way for a long time. The audio and videotapes in this investigation showed to the jurors in the criminal trial that occurred in the late 1990s in Chicago, where ADM executives were convicted, that ADM really was not concerned with ethics, morality, or law. It was concerned with fixing markets and maximizing its profits, and did not care whether that hurt its customers, consumers, or average people who have to buy things in stores. The ethic of doing business with dictatorships is a very problematic one for most decent people. Most decent people don't want to prop up totalitarian regimes, whether they're Soviet or totalitarian or fascist or whatever. ADM seems to have liked doing that. ADM had a very, very close relationship with the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. There were two businessmen in the world who were allowed to simply penetrate with their jets Soviet airspace. One was the late Armand Hammer, and the other was Dwayne Andreas. He really had unparalleled access to the Soviet ruling clique and was a big supporter of Gorbachev. I think hoped to prop up the Soviet Union long after the people there had had enough of it. He liked doing business with them because they were the essence of a command and control economy. If you made a deal with them from outside, they basically pay their bills. So he was happy with them. And I think he's seen the same thing. Basically, he sees that he can have the same relationship with Cuba. But by the same token, there is a fear of Cuba, because if the Cuban sugar industry is ever really rebuilt, Cuban sugar ever achieves its potential again, as I think it well could in a democratic Cuba, that would be very, very bad for ADM. So I think what ADM would like to do, and this is my opinion as well as that of others, is gain control of that economy and to the extent possible make sure that Cuban sugar is never free marketed.
It's important to recognize, though, that when a multinational corporation moves into a country, they effectively become partners with that country, for good or bad. And in a place like Cuba, inevitably it's bad, because what Castro is interested in is people who will play by his rules. So when a multinational corporation comes in, what they're saying is that they accept those rules, but they're prepared to accept them because they think they can make money out of it. When a country is interested, or a company like ADM is interested in a country like Cuba, clearly the competitive advantage that they're expecting is that the regime will see to it that they have a niche where they are protected, where they are guaranteed certain benefits that they would not accrue were there an open and free economic system. Castro has always been good at figuring out how to get political favor by giving economic favors. So he has a Spanish hotel chain, or a French multinational, or an American multinational, and he's able to pull them in and use their political clout in their home countries in order to try to benefit the regime. It's like ADM and Ilian. You have some very powerful economic interests who want to improve the relationship between Castro and the United States, but they want to do it on Castro's terms. And I think this is very destructive to what the Cuban people want and need, and it's also very destructive to the national security interests of this nation. Castro has always worked to have a measure of influence in the U.S. government. He's very good, again, at giving rewards to certain individuals, not just financial, but also psychic. And he plays very heavily on the desire of some people to believe, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that he has somehow developed a tropical paradise. He spends a lot of time, a lot of effort in cultivating media figures, Hollywood types, sportsmen, and politicians. And inevitably they go to Havana and they're given the official tour. They're not taken off the tour, they get the official tour with the requisite 6 or 7 hour lobster dinner with Fidel, and they leave thinking that they know something about Cuba and then that they know something about him. All of this is for a purpose, of course, the purpose being that he needs to maintain this division of opinion inside the United States in order to be able to have a free hand to operate, both to repress his own people and to support narco-terrorist groups overseas. He's been very successful at it. I mean, this is a great frustration that many of us feel, that certainly the belief that any rational individual taking a look at the facts of the record will inevitably come to the conclusion that this is a man who has destroyed his own country, killed tens of thousands of his own citizens, exported misery throughout the world, and yet there are still well-known Hollywood figures who come and fall at his feet. It defies logic in many ways. ADM has apparently a long history of working with countries like Castro's Cuba, where human rights are a far distant issue compared to the immediacy of quick capital or quick resources, quick profits. And what I believe that ADM was interested in was, of course, breaking open the embargo with them in the lead so that they would be able to monopolize the trade that was to come out of there. ADM, of course, is interested in all sorts of things like ethanol and alternate fuels, and sugarcane plays an important part in that. So I think that they were prepared to trade away many things in order to try to get a monopoly over Castro's sugarcane.
As far as what we know right now, Archer Daniel Midland wants to do a big grain trade with Cuba. It's a very powerful company. It has lined the pockets of politicians, both Democrat and Republican, because there's a big market in Cuba. There's a big market for American agriculture and grain. And ADM sells grain, and they'll go where the money is. Cuba, once Castro falls, will be like the 51st American state, but Archer's Daniel Midland doesn't want to wait. They want to profit now. And even the Bush administration, even with its claims that it wants to continue the embargo, is allowing the agricultural companies to go to Havana to engage in trade fairs, to do business. And ADM have a condominium complex up in Bal Harbor where preferential terms were given for condominiums for Bob Dole and for Bob Strauss of Republican Party and Democrat respectively. They line the pockets of both parties, and they are really anxious to get back into Cuba, and that helps explain why both Democrat and Republican administrations talk a good game against Castro, but they never take any hard action. But even the Bush administration has not been very tough with Castro. It has continued a 40-year-old failed embargo, which has done little to nothing. It's great symbolically, and I'm in favor of keeping it in place, but that's not going to remove Castro. We need stronger actions. Archer's Daniel Midland is only one of many companies that are trying to do business with Castro's Cuba. And there are Republican senators and congressmen from farm states that are trying to weaken the sanctions against Cuba. And even Governor Jeb Bush here in Florida has allowed Floridian firms to go down there, citrus firms, to talk about doing business with Cuba. So there's a lot of hypocrisy out there. And it wasn't just the Clinton administration, it's in the Bush administration too. The number one envoy to Latin America of the Western Hemisphere, Otto Reich, could not get confirmed for a permanent position because the Bush administration did not support him in terms of wanting to go against the Democrats. Now he has a better job now, he's in the White House. But it tells you that both Republicans and Democrats really don't want to confront the issue of taking down Fidel Castro. A dictator who for 44 years has killed and tortured more people than Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden combined. Yet for some reason we leave him only 90 miles off the shores of Florida. He is a greater threat to the United States than any of the dictators in the Middle East or even Asia.
For a long time, in Republican and Democratic administrations alike, there was more of a concern for stability than for either regime change or for the specific merits of an individual or an individual's case. The concern in the last administration, with some justification, looking at what happened in the 94 era with the rafter crisis, was to prevent another exodus, a mass exodus of people. And I'm afraid, from my distant vantage point, that this was an issue that drove policy. It was, what can we do to placate Castro, this madman in this island?
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think he gave all the nuclear bombs back. I think he may have one or two left. And he has a big bioweapons capability, which he could unleash on Florida and the country. And he has intelligence agents all over Miami and Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. Many have been arrested just in the last year alone. He probably has information that could compromise American politicians. Who knows? We've seen that recently with a spy scandal in Los Angeles involving a Chinese spy that was sleeping with half of the FBI. So you can only speculate, but I believe in the case of Clinton that because of Castro's affinity, his closeness with the Communist Chinese, and because the Communist Chinese were effectively bribing the Clinton administration and getting national security information in exchange, that the Chinese helped Castro extort the cooperation of Clinton. That's a theory. I don't know that for a fact, but with the Clinton administration, anything was possible.
We have a history in the United States of having Soviet agents infiltrating the White House. We had Harry Hopkins, who was the right-hand man to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was so close to Roosevelt that he lived in the White House part of the time. And he was a Soviet agent. We know this now from documents that have been unveiled in recent years. Documents coming out of Russia, documents of Venona papers going to Russia. So it is quite conceivable that there were people in the Clinton administration who had communist sympathies, Castro sympathies.
Hillary Clinton, according to a former friend of mine, now deceased, sadly, Barbara Olson, worked for a communist law firm in New York. Some people believe that Hillary Clinton is a communist.
Hillary was, when she was out in Berkeley, California, she was very close to the communists out in Berkeley. She was a radical, and she was also deeply involved in a foundation that was very left-wing. That's true that she was. She was at least sympathetic to the communists in Berkeley. The chairman of ADM, Dwayne Andreas, he is a very political person. He had long, very close ties to Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president.
ADM and Mr. Andreas have influence because they are a very big enterprise and they buy their products and sell in behalf of many, many farmers and agribusinesses, and it's a wide-ranging influence that they have. If they put their minds to it, they can influence many senators and congressmen whose districts would definitely benefit by what they are attempting to do. They would sell wheat and corn and soybeans and what have you. Actually, they would be giving these products to Castro because the bill would be picked up in the final analysis by the U.S. government, but you very seldom hear that in a convincing fashion, and they would never admit it. They say, oh no, this is a commercial sale, and in the background is lost the fact that would be a guarantee by U.S. financial institutions, which eventually are backed up by the U.S. government. As most people don't realize, the effort there is not so much to sell products to Castro as to deliver them to him with U.S. government-backed guarantees in a situation where he will never pay the bill, but they're being used not only by ADM and Mr. Andreas, but by Fidel Castro. And those who do not understand who it is that we're dealing with, the abject evil of the system that would be receiving these freebies from the U.S. taxpayer. Basically, Castro is what I call a left-wing Nazi. He's regarded by many people as a progressive, as a purveyor of social justice, basically a good guy because he is of the left. There's a perception of people, if you're of the left, you're basically okay. Problem is there's such things as left-wing Nazis. In Spanish it would be el fascismo de la izquierda. But the word fascist, the word reactionary, is very, very seldom, if ever, used for people of the left. It's always used for people of the right. And there are such things, of course, as right-wing fascists and reactionary right. But there are also left-wing fascists, the reactionary left. And if Castro were understood to be a man of the reactionary left, then 1/3 of the Congress of the United States would not be in bed with him. Because as leftists, they're not supposed to be in bed with fascists.
Fidel Castro is a communist, a dictator, never stood for an election, has persecuted people, has ruined the Cuban economy. We have all of these liberal, humanitarian Americans who have nothing but the greatest admiration and sympathy for the man. He took power actually with the help of Americans. Herbert Matthews, who was a correspondent for the New York Times, was instrumental in bringing the attention of the American people to the fact that Castro was holed up in the mountains with some troops. And according to Herbert Matthews, he deserved American support because Batista was such a terrible person, and Castro had a chance to overthrow him. And there were many journalists who had similar ideas. There was a reporter for CBS who helped organize a Fair Play for Cuba committee, which was a committee set up to promote Fidel Castro in this country. Despicable things that Castro was doing to the Cuban people have been glossed over. Castro was very careful not to permit journalists to come into Cuba who were hostile. He had them vetted in advance. If they were hostile to him, they couldn't get into the country. So it was the people who he could trust not to go out and report the realities that were admitted as journalists. By and large, most of the reporting, including now we have this Lucia Newman, who was down there for CNN. Lucia Newman was a supporter of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and she is a leftist. There is no way that she is going to say anything detrimental to Castro. This is the kind of thing that CNN does. I mean, they're doing it in Cuba by having a reporter like Lucia Newman. They couldn't get a reporter who would be critical of Castro down there, wouldn't be allowed to put somebody like that in. So this is why the reporting from Cuba has not been honest, and it has not given a fair view of the misery of the Cuban people.
I don't think the media has been fair in telling the reality about Cuba. Not the establishment media. Some elements of the media have. Some talk show hosts and Fox News, perhaps.
The American media has this very romantic image of Fidel Castro, almost like Woody Allen's movie Bananas. They think he's funny. He's not funny. He's a very deadly and serious dictator.
The media often just will give lip service to some outrageous repression that Castro and his regime engage in, so they can't be accused of having said nothing, but then they go on to something else, and basically much of the media doesn't want to talk about it, because their record is one of accommodation with Castro.
Castro has kind of this romantic image. You see all these visiting him, everybody from Barbara to Spielberg down there, basically shining his shoes. And they think it's very chic to be a friend of Castro.
And thinking of him and talking of him as a progressive and not such a bad guy after all, and literacy has been better and some rudimentary health care, and the excuses not to blame someone who is someone of the left, as they would blame a dictator who is otherwise known as a right-winger. It'd be all over his case then. But the left tends not to be critical of the left. And that's for that reason the media has not been adequately descriptive of the evil that man has wrought with Cuban people for almost half a century.
And then I think the media looks at this as a war that we fought 40 years ago and didn't win, and it's over, and it's not newsworthy. But all of that is not true, and we'll certainly see the evidence of that soon. Castro has been collaborating with dictators and terrorists in this hemisphere and around the world. Not just Osama bin Laden, not just Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, not just Saddam Hussein, but you have a terrorist now as president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. He's not just a communist, he's an avowed terrorist. He has admitted to that. We've got Lula in Brazil, the president of Brazil. We don't know where he is yet, but we do know that he has communist leanings. He's a good friend of Castro's. So the whole Castro issue is going to become much more widely debated in this country, and we hope to educate the American people as to what a threat he is.
It's absolutely vital that the American people, and particularly the elected representatives of the American people, understand the truth and reality about Cuba. There are a lot of forces at work that try to present Cuba in a way that is not appropriate. They do this because they think that there's some advantage to themselves, whether it be the sale of products or some kind of ideological gratification. It's unclear, but nevertheless, there are a lot of people saying a lot of things which just flat out aren't true about Cuba. Castro talks about the battle of ideas, but what he means by that is he wants his ideas put forward. He can't withstand a clash of ideas, and we have to be that. We have to provide the clash. We have to put forward to the American public and to the world the reality of what Castro regime has done to the Cuban people over the past 44 years. Former political prisoners, people who have suffered just unspeakable degradation and punishment in the tropical gulag that Castro maintains. Someone has to kind of bring them forward and let them meet with elected members of our Congress. Somebody has to be the voice also that goes into Cuba and tries to give hope and encouragement to those Cubans who are prepared to stand up and say enough is enough, that we deserve to live our lives as we see fit, not as someone tells us to. Wake up and look at what's going on. And my experience is that when you present the facts and you tell people, take a step back and look at what's going on, then they do see and they come to the right conclusions. But there are powerful forces out there. There's groups like ADM, the National Council of Churches, and others who have an interest in presenting a different view. And we can't let that be the only voice.
I came across a number of connections between ADM and Cuba. ADM has cultivated Fidel Castro since about 1995. ADM has been the leading American company in favor of a détente with the Castro regime in Cuba. It has brought many politicians to Cuba. It has assisted in bringing Cuban government officials to the United States, particularly to the Farm Belt. It has taken the lead in various types of trade fairs and exhibitions in Cuba, and it is extremely interested in the state of Cuban agriculture. A colleague of mine, a reporter from Decatur who went to Cuba, basically has said that ADM wanted to be Cuba's partner, run Cuban agriculture. Because if Cuban sugar ever hit the mainland in a true free market way, it would undercut ADM's largest product, which is high fructose corn syrup. And that could truly threaten the company's viability, its long-term existence. So I'm not the first to say this, but I think many people feel that ADM has an ongoing interest in making sure that the Cuban economy is controlled, that sugar never competes with its product, at least in the United States market. The reason why most Americans don't know much about ADM is that when you go to a store, you don't typically buy ADM products. You buy products that include ADM additives. Anyone who shops in a supermarket has ADM products in their food at home. Typically, monopolies or would-be monopolies that have close ties with the government like to keep a low public profile. Don't want people to know much about them because the people are paying more than they need to pay. And some of their foreign policy decisions, or the decisions that these companies would like us to make, and we frequently do make them, are extremely unpopular. So companies like ADM, and including ADM, attempt to create an image for themselves that's sort of friendly, but not very big on details. But I guarantee you that every single member of Congress knows ADM very, very well, because ADM is always passing money around Washington.
Yo que soy solo un niño, veo el mar, veo mil pajarillos volar. Un recuerdo muy mío guardaré, es la voz de mi madre que me dijo, yo contigo estaré. Yo tu ángel seré eternamente y muy dentro de tu corazón, allí contigo
Ilion touched a lot of people in a direct way, and I think to this day there are many Americans and other people across the globe who feel that this is a little boy who got caught up in a struggle far beyond him and paid a very heavy price. And it's sad that throughout this process that the best course of action for the child himself was only partially the interest of many of the people concerned. I think if you look at the groups like the National Council of Churches, they came forward and took a point of view with Ilion that they have not put forward in any other case that I am aware of. If you believe in family reunification, then it should apply to all families. And yet they have been beseeched, people begging them to intercede to help bring families that are trapped in Cuba out to the United States so that they can be reunited with their fathers or their mothers. And yet there's absolute silence on their part. It's inexplicable. How can they do that? I think if you look at companies like ADM, which put profit and market share above the interests of the people of the country they're working with, and I'll go further and say our people, our national interests. A company like this, you would think that they would figure out that it would be better to do business with a prosperous democracy that had a strong free enterprise system than to try to do business with a bankrupt dictatorship, which has gone into default and which owes money to everyone who's ever done business with me. You would think this would be kind of business 101, and yet it's not. Groups like this would rather go in and seize what they can at whatever cost to the people that are in that country, rather than let's doing it in a proper way and actually make more money at the end of the day, and the benefit of both sides, everyone. So it's disheartening in some way. More positively, though, I believe that Ilion made a lot of people take a close look at what's going on in Cuba. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me in the past year or two and say that they had never really realized, or maybe they understood on an intellectual level, but they didn't in their gut understand what life in a place like Castro's Cuba consisted of. And now they do. And so it may be that Ilion's legacy is that there have been hundreds, probably thousands of people who are now motivated to try to finally bring freedom to the people of Cuba.
Many people don't know much about the ADM involvement in the Elion case, although some journalists did pick up on this involvement. I know the London Financial Times wrote about it. There were some journalists in Florida who wrote about it. I think the Orlando Sentinel covered it. But it's kind of a typical ADM story because ADM tries to stay behind the scenes, in the shadows, and unless you know the players that ADM puts in place to accomplish its goals, you probably wouldn't pick up on it. I also know that David Hake, the ADM shareholders activist, who has been a very strong force for reform at ADM and for removing the questionable leaders of ADM, has said that he approached a reporter for the New York Times about writing about this story of ADM involvement. And that reporter said, no, that's completely off limits. He couldn't write about it.
Since 1995, when Archer Daniel Midland was busted for price fixing, a lot of people came out of the woodwork to write about it, and it was, front page news for a day or two, and there were the diehards that stuck around. There's between 80 to 100 people that I know in the media, some who had jobs around Decatur, others with AP, the manager of WND-TV, a couple newsmen have all lost their jobs. And the ones that are still standing and fighting ADM are independents like Carol and I, who sign our own paychecks. Alan Giebert, the largest syndicated ag columnist in the country, the author of Rats in the Graves, attorney James Lieber in Pittsburgh. And that's just about it, because they have the power to have you fired. They will mess with your business. They did ours. And before people take them on, they have to weigh the consequences of fighting this big 800-pound gorilla. We reminded them the story of David and Goliath. You can't come down. But yeah, it's dangerous. And you better be prepared to have your rice bowl broken, as we would say in Japan when I lived there, because they will come after you. And they will use in most cases, they use the government to come after you. And that's very shameful.
It seems very feasible to me that ADM had an interest in the Elion Gonzalez case. ADM had a very prominent Washington law firm represented, which was Williams & Conley, which also was President Clinton's law firm during his impeachment situation. Suddenly, Elion's father was represented by that law firm. There was a meeting of the grandmothers in Miami at Barry University. Barry University, I would call it a very closely connected institution to ADM. ADM has endowed it with millions and millions of dollars. The business school there is named after Dwayne Andreas's wife. The National Council of Churches, which was headed by Andrew Young, an ADM board member, a close personal friend of Dwayne Andreas, really organized that meeting. All the fingerprints of ADM were on the Elion situation. A very effective shareholders activist named David Hake also made inquiries about the defense fund to engage this Washington law firm, Williams & Conley, and was told Dwayne Andreas and his wife had contributed to it. It seemed to me that ADM has a close relationship with Fidel Castro, and when it became important to Fidel Castro to get this child back to Cuba, ADM really pulled every string it could and utilized all of its high-powered tools to make that possible.
Gregory Craig is a lawyer, very well known in Washington, D.C., formerly worked for the State Department, bills at about $1,000 an hour, very high priced. Works for a firm called Williams & Conley, which is a prestigious litigation firm. That law firm defended Clinton in all of his many scandals, including the impeachment proceedings. Gregory Craig was the impeachment lawyer for Bill Clinton. He was there during the impeachment trial in the Senate. Now, is it just coincidence that he was made lawyer of Fidel Castro, in effect, the National Council of Churches? I mean, the two were basically the same. That was not coincidence, and it shows you the closeness of the Clinton administration with the Castro regime. that Clinton wanted his own personal lawyer to effectively defend Castro and send that boy back to Cuba for propaganda purposes, and he continues to be exploited by Castro. Obviously, Clinton was returning a favor to Fidel Castro or avoiding Castro doing something against him. And that's a story that we're still getting into in terms of learning more and more.
Greg Craig was selected because, one, he was from Williams and Conley. Two, he's well known in Washington, D.C. He has a special relationship with Janet Reno. He was also very active in the impeachment hearings of former President Clinton, and a very good lawyer. One must give him that. But what was very interesting about Greg Craig was he was working on this project from early January, because I listened to his interview on Diane Sawyer when he supposedly had been hired the week before. He said, we've been trying to get the family for a couple months to give the boy back.
We have been asking for them to give a voluntary transfer of custody to the father for many, many months.
So he was on the payroll of ADM long before it became public. And Greg Craig was selected because he takes orders. And that's Williams and Conley is part of the silent government and one of the biggest law firms in Washington, D.C., and very powerful. The lady who was raising the money for paying for Greg Craig, I called on the telephone. And I must be honest, I did fib to her a little bit to confirm. I said, I live up the beach from the Andreses, which I do. And I said, I want to donate what they donated to the Juan Gonzalez fund. Lawyers Fund, and I said, what they give? She said they both gave $10,000 each, meaning Dwayne and his wife Inez, and that was denied by Dwayne's secretary in Decatur. But the lady who told me was the lady who was collecting the money, and other sources now tell us that there was $90,000 given by the Andreses, sons, nephews, and their wives, which is very common, the same as political contributions.
After Elian was rescued, there was a period where there was not a lot of interest from Cuba, his well-being. All of the outpouring of thanks and gratitude and blessings were coming from the United States, where he was reunited with his relatives. Clearly, what happened here, and by the way, to my knowledge, the father did not express any particular interest in having him return to Cuba during this time period. What did happen, though, is that I think Castro saw that Elian was being held up as a symbol for all that was wrong with his regime, that it was necessary for a mother to push out on a leaky raft in the middle of high seas, to risk her life and to in fact lose her life in order to give this young boy a chance for freedom. And at that point, Castro determined that he was going to get this child back. And at that point, the father all of a sudden became interested in having the child come back. And I think also at that point is when you saw the ADMs, the National Council of Churches, and these other groups become interested in seeing the child go back. There were a number of forces that came together in Elian. You know, I was serving as ambassador overseas when this happened. But I was traveling back to the United States fairly regularly during this time period. And what became clear is that there was, I don't think it's too strong a word to use, conspiracy of forces that were trying to make sure that the end result of this saga was that this poor little boy was going to be sent back to Cuba without respect to what might have been in his best interest. I think if you look at the activities of the National Council of Churches, of corporations like ADM, of legal authorities like Mr. Craig, clearly they came together and the financing worked out amongst them to present a very formidable force, again, to try to force Elian back to Cuba. At the end of the day, the truth or the best interest of the child or the national interest of the United States were all secondary to trying to make sure that these groups maintain their favored status with the Castro regime.
The National Council of Churches' involvement with the Elian case is clearly linked to its sympathy for the Castro regime. It makes sense just from a logical perspective. For instance, say someone is a supporter of apartheid South Africa. They're going to take actions to benefit that regime, just in an abstract sense. If I support communist Cuba, and there's a young child whose mother died trying to emancipate that child, is it going to be more constructive to Fidel Castro for me to maintain that child should live in a free society, or to try to return that child to Fidel Castro? So I think just in terms of logic, it is an outgrowth of their Castroite sympathies.
Joan Brown Campbell with the National Council of Churches is a very close friend of Dwayne Andrews because the National Council of Churches is funded by ADM. Without ADM's backing, cash, and being able to open doors, Joan Brown Campbell would not be very effective. She's proven herself to be a great public speaker. She knows a lot of the elected officials that are close friends of Dwayne and have obtained considerable contributions from the Andrews and Archers Daniel Midland. So she's very powerful because of her relationship with Dwayne. The National Council of Churches without Dwayne Andrews is nothing.
The history of the National Council of Churches, particularly the, what you could call the moral history of it, is very interesting. It's founded in 1950, and initially it's very conscientious against communist persecution. It condemns the violation of religious freedom in Soviet Russia, the purges in Soviet Russia. It condemns the invasion and occupation of Hungary, condemns the invasion of Czechoslovakia in the late 1960s, and in other contexts, it's vigorously anti-apartheid, calls for sanctions for apartheid, disinvestment from South Africa, calls for sanctions for white-controlled Rhodesia, and yet when it comes to other regions, the National Council of Churches begins to decline, particularly in the 1960s. Cuba, of course, being a clear example, Vietnam being another example. That's when we begin to see its ideological sympathies become more grotesque in several forms. For example, in the 1970s, a member of the National Council of Churches, a Reverend Paul McCleary, testifies before Congress regarding Vietnam's, quote, re-education camps that are in fact concentration camps for conscientious Vietnamese, modeled on the Soviet system, and Reverend McCleary describes them as or the one he visited, in terms of a tropical resort, and that the occupants of those gulags were engaged in a work-study experience. And this is before Congress. It would be hilarious if it weren't so obscene. So the National Council of Churches' moral arc is very bizarre.
The National Council of Churches, some say, was started by ADM and used outside the country. And I think it was 1991 the National Council of Churches was allowed to operate in the United States. Or it might be 93. I think it was given authorization under Clinton. Totally funded by ADM, at least 95% of it. Joan Brown Campbell is Dwayne's good friend, and upon her retirement he donated another $100,000 to the National Council of Churches. And when Reverend Edgar, who brought the grandmothers of Elian in, he wasn't able to handle the crowd and the media, so Dwayne went back and got Reverend Campbell to come in and run the show, which he was very good at. Andrew Young, who's the president of the National Council of Churches, is also an ADM board member, has been since 1997, and is on the Public Policy Committee and also the Audit Committee. Is a very powerful man in the circles in Atlanta and also in Washington, D.C. And Dwayne recruited him to sit on the board in 1997. It's the same year that he invested in Cuba through Spain.
We're not currently doing anything with the National Council of Churches, but it was probably involved because it has very leftist leanings. It's sympathetic to Castro. It is sympathetic to communist causes throughout the world. We do have socialists in this country, and they are to the far left, and they believe very strongly in a socialist economy, in a socialist state. And the National Council of Churches is one of those groups.
The National Council of Churches is a very left-wing organization. Not only are they great sympathizers with Fidel Castro, but they were sympathizers with many of the left-wing regimes in Africa and elsewhere. I believe ADM were giving money to the National Council of Churches, or if not, to people who were affiliated with the National Council of Churches, namely Andrew Young, who had become the president of that council. And the National Council of Churches had been very instrumental in bringing Elian's two grandmothers to the U.S. to visit with Elian, and they were working also very hard to get public opinion in this country in favor of sending Elian back.
The National Council of Churches, with regard to Elian Gonzalez, literally played a leading role in returning a child whose mother had died at sea as a refugee to bring him into a free society. The National Council of Churches led a campaign to send this child from the very regime his mother had died fleeing.
The involvement of the National Council of Churches in the Elian case, I believe, started with the arrangements that they made to bring the two grandmothers to Florida, where they met with Elian. And the behavior of the grandmothers, to my mind, was very suspicious. For example, one of them said that one of the first things she did was grab his genitals. And why would a grandmother grab a child's genitals? I don't know what the reaction to that was in Cuba, but if it had been the other way around, if it had been an American grandmother that had gone down to Cuba, and since she grabbed the child's genitals, she would have been ridiculed.
One of the planes used in this exercise, and I forget exactly which flight it was, the tail number on the plane belonged to Archer's Daniel Midland. And now one of the planes was leased from GE, and there were two planes involved in the movement of people back and forth. But the plane that flew Elian to Opa-locka for that first planned meeting that didn't take place was Archer's Daniel Midland's airplane. The tab for all of this transportation costs of the various airplanes, hotels, whatnot, was all paid by ADM money. Now, it might have been funneled through the National Council of Churches, and the church paid for it, but the source of income for this whole escapade or saga was Archer's Daniel Midland and Dwayne Andrus. Dwayne lives at the Seaview Hotel here in Val Harbor, and they made that kind of his headquarters. Here he has a home over in Indian Creek too, but he likes to stay at Val Harbor. And when he was the big wheel down at Seaview, he's still a powerful man there, ADM had an account at the hotel, and when congressmen and senators would come to visit, they would get a little walk-around envelope, the manager told me, and it would have $5,000 cash in it. And this would be billed to ADM Carpet on a monthly basis. And so how things actually, how the money moves, it moves in cash a lot. But Dwayne believes in the golden rule. Those that have the gold make the rules. So he brings all the cash to the table.
During the Elian affair, Miss Campbell was in the media quite often. I recall her on Larry King, many other media outlets, so she had quite a high profile. And it was a profile that she did not shun, obviously. She accepted it, and in accepting it, she brings disgrace upon herself and her institution. To behave in such a way, to be so silent about such flagrant persecution, and always trying to evade it. There is little excuse for that kind of lack of solidarity. It's a tragic irony that many religious leaders, such as Joan Brown Campbell, do engage in these missions, they frequently call them, to Cuba, of solidarity with the Cuban regime. It brings to mind something the former political prisoner Armando Valladares once wrote, who was a political prisoner from 1960 until 1982. He talked about how in prison the guards would read them and talk to them about the messages of support they would receive from clergy and religious individuals abroad to demoralize them. And he wrote that, that it wasn't the beatings and it wasn't all the other degradations that demoralized us as much, but to hear that our free religious brethren, as they perceived them abroad, were giving solidarity not to the Christian prisoners of conscience in Cuba, but to the regime that subjugated them. That was very demoralizing to hear. And hence the great moral void in such religious missions to Cuba. I would add that I don't have any problem with individuals traveling to Cuba, but it is why they are traveling. Are they traveling for solidarity for the oppressed or for the oppressors? And in the case of the National Council of Churches, I think the solidarity is quite apparently not with the oppressed.
Quite honest with you, I had never heard of the National Council of Churches, but when you hear an organization with a name like that, there's certain things that go with it. I made the mistake of assuming that they actually believe their own press releases. And by that I mean, in the wake, after Elian had gone back, it became apparent that there were many children who were separated from their families, but they were separated and that they were detained in Cuba and not allowed to reunite with their families in the United States. And most of these were specific cases where the Castro regime was punishing family members who had defected, who had come to the United States. So we were interested in saying, well, if the National Council of Churches believes in the reunification of families, then ideally they should also become as involved and devote the same sorts of resources to bringing people out of Cuba. And of course, there was absolute dead silence. No interest, no response. I mean, it's sad, but there it is.
And in a present context, the National Council of Churches has demonstrated, again, a flagrant lack of solidarity in terms of Iraqi subjugation of the Iraqi people by another tyrant of a decades-long reign of terror. The National Council of Churches opposed intervention in Iraq, opposed liberation of Iraq, and I doubt they would have opposed such vigorous action if it had been South Africa, where they supported economic sanctions. But sanctions toward Iraq, no. It's really not even whether one supports or opposes sanctions, it's about consistency. In the National Council of Churches, inconsistency. In a way, inconsistency is the worst sin, because you're starting to apply different standards to certain human beings, and that does not reflect well upon an institution to do.
Berry University here in Bal Harbour, Florida, has a long relationship with the Andres family. Inez Andres, Dwayne Andres' wife, was the chairman of the Board of Trustees for 18 years. They have named a school after D. Inez Andres School of Business. Dwayne and Archer's Daniel Midland separately have been big donors of cash to Berry University. And the now president of Archer's Daniel Midland, G. Allen Andres' wife, sits on the board of Berry University. He's been a big donor to Berry University. Sister Jean hosted the meeting for the grandmothers in Ellen at her place, and this all goes back because of ADM's connection. And to bring the grandmothers to Berry to meet with Elion was a safe place because Sister Jean O'Laughlin, the president of Berry, was not going to let anything happen there except what was supposed to happen, that the children visit with the grandmothers. There would not be a snatch and grab. That meeting was held the first part of April. In May, Berry University received $5 million from Dwayne Andres as a donation. That was not publicized, but she confirmed with me on the telephone that she did get that. But she said that was promised to her a year or so before. Well, those of us who know Dwayne Andres, he doesn't promise anything a year in advance. He gives, he rewards. But that was her opinion. I disagree with her. I believe that she was rewarded once again for the work that she has done on behalf of Andres in Cuba, which also she has been the facilitator for moving in 100 to 300,000 tons of food into Cuba, supposedly to feed the starving children, where our sources say it's to feed the tourists that come to the island. So they're very powerful people. And in circles in the Midwest, I'm formerly from St. Louis, Berry University is known as Andres University. And I believe that the university was rewarded for their role in trying to legitimize what took place here in southern Florida concerning Elliot. The only contact that I've had with Sister Jean over the years is what I've read about her and heard through various publications of ADM and other literature here in southern Florida. She seems to be very active, very powerful in the Catholic community here. And the only time that I've ever had a conversation with her was when she called me on a Saturday after I had published something over the internet concerning Barry and her role in connection to ADM. And she was very critical of a book written by James Lieber who exposed the carpet crimes of ADM. And she said, so they fix prices, it's nothing, Walgreens fixes prices too. Well, maybe I should call Walgreens CEO and let him know that Sister Jean is aware that price fixing's going on at his drugstores. But I've only spoke with the lady once. And I've written about her numerous times after that, and nobody's ever responded from Barry, and I've offered to meet with her in public or whatever, and they don't want to hear about ADM.
They're a very wealthy company, and they have lots of money to throw around. They were giving money to some of the religious organizations that were involved in the Gonzalez case and trying to get Elian returned to Cuba. It appears that they were certainly in a position where they felt that they ought to do something to be helpful and get Castro in their debt so they could get better terms from him.
I would say that there was, I hate to call it a brain trust, but certainly a group of individuals, starting with Castro himself, who micromanages these kinds of things, working through the members of the Cuban interest section here in Washington, with the collaboration and support of groups like the National Council of Churches, like ADM, perhaps with their deep pockets, financing some of these activities. So clearly there was close coordination between the Castro regime and elements of American society on a scale that had never happened before.
We uncovered, right before Elian was sent back to Cuba, documents. We had again filed Freedom of Information Act requests. That's when you can ask for documents out of the U.S. government. We had to bring a lawsuit to get those documents. And we asked for the documents on an emergency basis before Elian was going to be sent back to Cuba before the raid. And we found in those documents that the Clinton administration, in particular the Immigration and Naturalization Service, Janet Reno and Doris Meisner as part of the Justice Department, was collaborating, was actually coordinating press events and legal actions with the Castro regime. Those documents show that. So when we obtained those documents, we made a last-ditch effort to have Elian remain in the United States. Elian's lawyers had lost up to that point in time. The Gonzalez family asked us to step in. We filed a motion here in Miami in federal court with Judge Michael Moore, and literally just seconds before Elian was put on the plane, Judge Moore denied our motion to relook at the issue, because what we learned was that a fraud had been perpetrated on the court. That in fact, Elian's father wanted the boy to remain here, that the Clinton administration knew that the father wanted the boy to remain here, but they had covered that up, and in fact they gave the impression that the father wanted the boy to return to Cuba. Now, Judge Moore was under a lot of political pressure. The Supreme Court had just ruled against the family. He would have upset an administration in power, and frankly, I think he lacked the courage to do what he should have done.
Él fue muy amenazado. Entonces, la misma inmigración de aquí no le dio nunca una oportunidad. El muchacho no tuvo la oportunidad de nadie que lo ayudara, porque nosotros queríamos hablar con él y el mismo gobierno de Cuba, en combinación con la administración de Clinton, no nos dejaba que hablara con nosotros. Entonces, el muchacho no sabe. Aquí le están diciendo que no se puede quedar. Janet Reno y la inmigración le dice que no se puede quedar. El abogado que le consiguieron a él es prácticamente un custodia lo que él tenía. ¿Qué va a hacer el muchacho? Él no sabe que podía arrancar a correr y pedir asilo y que todo después le tenían que entregar a sus familiares, porque él no sabe vivir en democracia. Él no tuvo la decisión de hacerlo porque no tiene conocimiento. Pero yo pienso que si él había tenido la oportunidad de hablar con nosotros, él había pensado distinto.
Janet Reno was basically acting under orders from the White House, from the orders from her boss, from the president. And she, at some point, may have been able to go in and say, Mr. President, we can't do this. This is a matter for the Florida courts, and this is something we should not get into. It's not a geopolitical matter as such. And she may have been able to persuade otherwise. As Attorney General, she should have viewed it more dispassionately and not as a political issue and not as a way to accommodate the dictator in Cuba. And perhaps tried, which I don't think she did, tried to talk the Clinton White House out of the position that it finally took, and then became the principal spear carrier for that effort as Attorney General.
Conduct was despicable, conduct we've never seen before in this country, where an Attorney General and the head of the INS deny even a hearing to a little boy who was seeking freedom.
Los días que Elisa se había llevado al niño, a ellos nos llamaron y nos dijeron, Elisa se fue, ten al tanto, por si llegan ahí que ustedes sepan quiénes, dónde están y cómo es, que ustedes se preocupen por eso. Entonces nosotros empezamos a indagar. Yo inclusive y mi hermano le dijimos que eso había que esperar porque no se podía hacer otra cosa que esperar, hasta que se dio la noticia de que el niño había aparecido, que había un niño y eso. Entonces mi hermano fue y lo reconoció. Entonces Juan Miguel nos dice, bueno, las primeras palabras, bueno, cuídenmelo ahí hasta tanto. Pero en eso el gobierno se interpone y le vio punta a la cosa y agarran a Juan Miguel, y Juan Miguel se perdió unos 3 días, que no hablaba ni preguntaba por el niño ni nada de eso. Entonces yo supongo que lo cogió en la seguridad del Estado allá y le habló y le dijo 20 cosas, lo amenazó. Y el muchacho tuvo que accedió a los deseos de ese dictador. Y entonces él empezó a hacerle juego por miedo a que lo fueran a matar, porque el gobierno mata. Se sabe que el gobierno mata, que no hay razón, ni motivo, ni ley, ni justicia, y te matan. Entonces el muchacho quiso salvar su vida y se plegó al gobierno, como a lo mejor pensando, mi hijo está aquí, pero está vivo. Y si yo me opongo a esto, a lo mejor me lo matan allá y a lo mejor me matan a mí y a toda mi familia. ¿Sabe Dios lo que pasó por la cabeza de ese niño? Porque todo el mundo le echa la culpa a él, pero hay que estar en los zapatos de ciertas personas para saber. Y más un gobierno que tú sabes que mata.
The alien came to this country in and around Thanksgiving Day. He was snatched out of the home of Lazaro and Mary Salesius Gonzalez on Easter weekend, and he went back in and around July 4th. The story goes that he was in an inner tube for 48 or so hours. He was saved by dolphins that scared sharks away. For Janet Reno to take that kind of a beautiful story and destroy it by having stormtroopers go into the neighborhood of Elian Gonzalez with gas and with batons, beating American citizens like this was Nazi Germany, to send a boy back to Cuba without even giving him a hearing, it's an incredible crime that she committed. And that's why we are representing the citizens of Little Havana, Donato Dalrymple, the fisherman, and the Gonzalez family, in a civil rights lawsuit against Janet Reno to hold her personally responsible. Because unless you can hold the officials that are responsible, personally responsible, it's going to happen again. And who's defending Janet Reno? The current Attorney General of the United States, because they all protect each other. It's one big club in Washington. And if Judicial Watch doesn't do it, then who's going to do it? We stand for the principle that nobody's above the law, even Janet Reno.
El niño se fue de aquí, más nunca hemos podido hablar con él. Y con Juan Miguel, cuando estaba aquí en los Estados Unidos, que ya se habían llevado el niño, hablamos varias veces, pero el pobre muchacho tenía que decir lo que le dijera seguridad del Estado, que le estaban grabando y le estaban diciendo todo.
The Elian case was not a simple custody case at all. It attracted the enormous attention of the White House, the Justice Department, the State Department. It was a real cause célèbre for reasons that we can suspect and know in general terms, but don't know the great details of. It was a high-level policy decision that Castro was going to be accommodated. The White House and the Justice Department and State Department combined have a mighty powerful way of getting things done the way they like, whether it's in the courts, in the Congress, anywhere else. And, of course, in the Congress, there was a fairly big contingent, mostly Democrats, but some Republicans, too, who just either wanted the issue to go away and things settled back down to peace, or that Castro, their fellow progressive, as some of them think of him, might be accommodated, and that things would therefore be better in our relations with him as a result of that. I surely do believe there were talks and communications of various kinds between the administration and Castro and his regime. For certain there was. Between Castro, if not himself personally with his agents, and might as well have been personally, and probably conversations with the man himself in ways that the Clinton administration, Janet Reno or others in her behalf, would never admit to be happened, but it was collaboration, I think, in an effort to get this thing settled to the satisfaction of Fidel Castro and of the White House. The nature of the raid, to me, proved the basic injustice of what the Justice Department was trying to do. They should have been able, through persuasion and calm activity and so forth, achieve a just goal. And the fact that they had to come in with armed militia and shock troops, so to speak, is a proof that if your argument doesn't work, then use force. People could have been killed in that thing just to prove the point that, by God, the Justice Department and the State Department and the White House could do what they wanted to do. In a way, it almost of the same ilk as the activity at Waco 4 or 5 years earlier. That was an extreme action to a situation which could have been done even with more time and more effort and more frustration in getting the point if they'd been right. There was something of similar nature to the decision-making that went into both of those. Well, we can't settle it rationally. Let's just break down the doors, burn down the house, and if necessary, shoot everybody in sight. And there's something very perverse about that. Americans should learn that if there is a just cause to be realized in such an effort to get a certain thing done, in this case moving this child back to Cuba, it ought to be done rationally and calmly and not in an attack mode in the middle of the night in what some people call Gestapo tactics. That's a little bit strong, but not all that off base, particularly if something had gone wrong. They should learn that out of that comes a realization that what happened was probably not correct, or it would not have had been forced violently as it was. It went over the heads and beyond the reach of the law itself in some ways. I don't know all the technicalities of what happened there, but apparently there's some question that whether it was an unauthorized and illegal action, whether they'd actually gotten the signatures of the judges or the officials there to make it truly legal. And it was very, very near the edge, if not over the edge of legality. And we should learn that that kind of thing should not be allowed to happen. And when it does, it ought to be examined in great detail to make sure that it never happens again. And I don't think, in the aftermath, it was examined in the greatest possible detail. Who would examine it? The Justice Department, which had just authorized what happened? My feelings about as an American about the Pelion case is that I've been disappointed. I was greatly disappointed in the government at the time, the White House, the State Department, the Justice Department, in some elements of the Congress, because they wouldn't stand up for justice and correctness and right versus wrong, but bowed to the desires of the White House and the Justice Department, principally the White House. That's where the decision was made. And then once that decision was made, no way to stop it. And so that it reminds us of what can be done if, for whatever motivation, the White House and its agencies decide to do is extremely difficult to stop. And so it means that we need to be ever attentive to what is happening in the Oval Office and make sure that its motivations are correct to the extent we possibly can. And when they're not, vote the troublemaker out of office so that he does not abuse the system, as was the case in the situation of Juan Miguel Gonzalez. Certainly justice has not been served, by my standards, sending a young man from a multi-party, pluralist, civil libertarian, democratic life which lay ahead of him back into a situation of left-wing fascism. And there's no way to interpret what happened to him as anything other than a disaster for him and for people who loved him and supportive of him here. It served a purpose for Castro and his dictatorship. They won. It served a purpose for the Clinton administration. Somehow they won, or they think they did, by their demented standards, but not for the young man.
The whole saga of Elian is something that not only has created a wound in Miami that'll never heal, it's just as strong today as it was 2 years ago. It was a national disgrace, something that will never live down. It's a black mark in American history. And until we bring Castro to justice, that black mark will get worse in the minds of Cuban Americans and Hispanics and Anglos who believe in liberty. If it had been your child, would you have wanted him to go back to Cuba? Many, many Peter Pans live here in Miami, kids that were sent by their parents alone, including some famous Latin rock stars like Willie Chirino and others who can understand what this was all about. And we need to communicate to the American people how we can never allow this to happen again. Because it might be a Cuban American this time, but it could be a member of your family the next time.
Not in defense of Janet Reno or the lady from the INS. They're just hired soldiers. Bill Clinton was told what to do over this. These were not decisions they made. These were the decisions that were made by the people like the Andreas, the Williams and Conley, right? And Janet Reno just executed. what she was told to do. I have no doubt in my mind, if John Ashcroft was the Attorney General then, the same thing would have happened. This is what we have to get away from, the us and them. You know, everybody says, well, the Democrats did it or the Republicans did it. No, this is America. We let it happen. Permissiveness is a destructive force, and corporate America runs the country, not the people.
In the alien case, there were entities that were closely associated with ADM that really coalesced during the course of that crisis. One, of course, was Williams & Connolly, the Washington law firm that has been involved with ADM since it got Dwayne Andreas acquitted in a Watergate trial for allegedly illegal campaign contributions. Then there was the National Council of Churches, which was headed by Andrew Young, who was one of Dwayne Andreas's closest personal friends and has been since he was Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the United Nations. The National Council of Churches, of course, set up the meetings with the grandmothers, brought the grandmothers here, and was a big expediting force in the whole situation. The site of the meetings with the grandmothers was Barry University. Barry University is a tremendous beneficiary of Andreas' wealth. The business school is named after Dwayne Andreas' wife, Inez. You could kind of see, if you knew who these people were, the fact that all of them came together and they're all so closely associated with ADM, at least made me and certain other journalists who follow ADM and its influence feel that this was a favor by ADM to Fidel Castro in order to keep the ball rolling in their ongoing economic relationship.
One of the problems today in this country with getting the stories out that need to be out is not with the reporters, it's not even with the production people, it's the editors. Corporate America controls the newspapers, they control the media, they control the radio stations. So it's not so much that the media doesn't want to, it's just part of the overall plan. Corporate America controls what is said about their corporation. The truth comes out about these corporations, their stock wouldn't be in such good shape. And the problem with the financial reporters today, the ones that are on television and in the various financial papers, they're cheerleaders for investment bankers. Most of them talking about these companies have never studied their 10K or read their financial statements. So it's not that the media is afraid. The media is paid to do what they're doing. And that's put the wool over everybody's eyes.
The only media that goes to Cuba, of course, is media that's going to be, or they believe is favorable. You don't get a visa to Cuba unless you're perceived to be either helpful or harmless. So anyone who does investigative journalism, anyone who will ask the difficult questions, just doesn't get to Cuba. Furthermore, as we've seen, not just in Cuba, but in other countries, news bureaus often place a higher value on being in a place than actually doing something once they get there. If you do critical reporting in Cuba, your bureau is closed. So there's a self-censorship that takes effect. And when taken to its extremes, in companies that we all know, you find stories about 79-year-old jazz guitarists and the latest festival in a small town, but not stories on political oppression or the conditions in prisons. It's actually, I think it's a shameful dereliction of duty, but clearly it's something that's fairly widespread.
The U.S. media was very biased and it was very skewed, the reporting, because it didn't appreciate how Cuban Americans in Miami are fighting for freedom. It didn't appreciate what communism means in Cuba. We now know that with executions and violations of human rights renewing again in a major way. There was just simply a disconnect.
The coverage of the Elian affair persistently depicted an issue without a moral context. It was as if you had a million savage people of Hispanic origin in South Florida trying to hijack and hold hostage a young boy. That is the impression one received from the American media. I didn't see a lot of emphasis in the media, for example, about Elian's mother. How did Elian get here after all? I didn't see that highlighted a lot. And that omission, just as with the National Council of Churches' omission of many pertinent facts, is quite interesting.
I also think there's a backlash in this country against Cuban Americans and against Hispanics. Hispanics have become the leading minority. They're even greater than other minorities at this point in time, and there's a certain envy and jealousy that plays a role, because Cubans have done very well here in Miami.
It happened during this time that I managed to break my arm in 3 places, a jungle triathlon, and I was spending time in Miami trying to get patched together, and all I had to do all day was basically click through and watch the news. What I found is if I watched the national news, the CNNs and the others, inevitably they would have a tight focus shot on a hysterical 70-year-old woman screaming in Spanish. And this was the image that was being conveyed to America and the world at large.
For one to claim that the U.S. media coverage of the Elian affair was balanced would be like claiming that newspapers in the southern United States during segregation were balanced regarding issues of black freedom. It would not be credible in that context, as it would not be credible in the previous context.
One of the problems, I believe, in trying to get the truth out here is the spin. People in America were starting to hate Cuban Americans before this was all over. Well, why don't we just send the boy back and let's put this chapter behind us? I think the Cuban Americans made a great stand, and kept the lights on this thing. It might be a year or 2 years or 5 years till the truth really comes out of what took place here. As soon as somebody like Archer Daniel Midland's involved, the cover-up starts to take place. Put the lights on somebody else. The American people supported what was going on here, and I think one of the ways that ADM was able to win was they made this a Cuban American problem. This was not. This was an American problem. This was a dark day in American history that a SWAT team, stormtroopers, did what they did. This is sad. And they knew that the American people would take it. They took Ruby Ridge and they took Waco and flipped channels to watch the football game. And until Americans get involved, the people that are supposed to be servants of the people will continue to be the masters.
The main reason that the U.S. media is sympathetic, empathetic, supportive, accepting of what Castro does and who he is that the dominant media in the country is left of center, some of it more than slightly left of center. And they therefore are typically more accepting of anyone else who is supposedly left of center. And since the labels that they use readily for the right, reactionary, fascist, repressive, and all these nasty labels, are never ever used for people on the left, or all too seldom. It leads to a state of mind in which, well, people on the left are not so bad after all. At least they have laudable or wonderful goals in mind. People's democracy, the very labels that dominate the language about people of the left, would tend to have you believe that they're better than they are, that they're not elements of the fascist left, the Nazi left. No such thing exists in the language of the media. You would never see those words there. And so you never see the thoughts there, that such people do exist, and frankly more so than do on the right. Totalitarian regimes are almost always socialist rather than tin-horn dictatorship of a Batista, Marcos, even a Pinochet. Those are authoritarian regimes, dictatorships in some sense, but if you're a totalitarian regime, you're always socialist. Because if you don't own the economy or control it to a degree that is tantamount to ownership, you're not a totalitarian. So all totalitarians are of the left, but you can never get the left-wing media to admit that.
See reports that the boy should be with his father. Well, the fact of the matter is the boy was not going to be with his father. The boy was going back and going into an educational system in Cuba where the state was going to be determining what he would do and what he would believe. That story was very inadequately conveyed to the American people by our media. I think it was a great flaw because the public did not have an opportunity really to get a good understanding of what the Cuban educational system is like under Castro.
We see periodically as dignitaries kind of go through Cardenas, or Castro has a birthday party, all kinds of staged events that go along. Clearly, he's being groomed. The regime has invested a lot in him. I suspect that unlike most of his compatriots, his fellow classmates, he is given advantages that they are not. and that there's always this myth of kind of the new man, that socialism or Cuban communism is going to produce the new man. They never do, because it's a failed vision. But nevertheless, I think that they're going to try as hard as they can to mold Ilian into that image, whether he wants to be it or not.
La intención del gobierno es como lavarle el cerebro al niño para que no sepa que él estuvo en libertad tanto tiempo. Y entonces le dieron una casa aparte a Juan Miguel. En Cárdenas en sí son las casas que ellos le han quitado a todos los que han venido para el exilio. Y entonces le dieron una casa a la afuera de Cárdenas que le dicen el fuerte, como quien va a coger la carretera central por Coliseo. Y ahí le dieron una casa que la tienen custodiada con un guardia adelante y otro atrás. Y entonces nadie puede pasar por enfrente de la casa, tiene que brincar por la acera enfrente. Nadie se puede parar allí, ni nadie puede estar observando nada de lo que está sucediendo dentro de la casa. Le regalaron un carro con 2 policías. Los policías determinan con quién habla, con quién se mira, cómo se baja, dónde va. Entonces le dicen a Juan Miguel que esos son 2 guardaespaldas para cuidarlo. Pero no, en sí no es eso, porque lo tienen ahí para que él no se mueva, para tenerlo chequeado constantemente día y noche. La única privacidad de Juan Miguel en estos momentos es cuando él está durmiendo con su señora en la cama. En casa de Juan Miguel hay un teléfono que está controlado por el gobierno, teléfono privado. Parece que para ellos mismos tener contacto con Juan Miguel y llamar, pero todo el que llama del exterior no le dan entrada, ni de Cuba mismo. En Cuba yo tengo entendido que los familiares tienen que pedir permiso para ir a ver al niño y decir lo que van a hablar y decir de qué van a hablar. Los propios familiares, tías, primos.
The Cuban Americans are the most patriotic group of people in this country. They're still in the front lines. They're still fighting communism. Their relatives are being slaughtered by Fidel Castro. We have clients who were in prison for 27 years who saw their mothers dismembered in front of them, who had their wives brought in, raped by prison guards in front of them. People can't imagine the tyranny of Fidel Castro. We can here in Miami. But the message for the American people is that Fidel Castro is Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and the head of the IRA all wrapped into one. He's as bad as all of them combined.
My wife, Carol, and I knew that ADM was involved. Carol said, we have to put this puzzle together. This was in early January. So we put the pieces together from our repository of information. We started sending stuff to the Miami Herald, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, newspapers that we had a relationship with. And nobody would touch this story. We finally got an introduction to a lady called Nancy Dunn at the London Financial Times. I called her and faxed her up material. She published an article January 28th, which really upset ADM from what we hear. And there was another article, the 27th, was Decatur Herald Review, written by Paul Brinkman, and he lost his job a couple months later for exposing ADM's relationship with Andrew Young, Reverend Edgar, and Joan Brown Campbell. We circulated a lot of material. Some of it got in the hands of Charlie Reese at the Orlando Sentinel the week before Elian was taken out. When he wrote his article, which was published in the Sunday Orlando Sentinel, April the 23rd, he says, when you read this, something might have already happened. So it was very important for Archer's Daniel Midland and the government to remove Elian from the house, because if this article would have hit, it would have got a lot of recognition, and people said, okay, now this makes sense. And I think it's just now starting to sink into a lot of people exactly what took place here. The first casualty in dealing with Archer's Daniel Midland is the truth.
I guess in terms of the ongoing relationship between ADM and the government, I kind of am sorry that the government didn't follow the ADM story to its logical conclusion. It protected some of the highest people in ADM. It made secret deals to the effect that the chairman of ADM and the president would not be indicted, would not have to testify at grand juries, and would not even be interviewed. Janet Reno refused to answer questions about that. But that should be unacceptable. And I really think that if the government had pursued ADM more vigorously, that perhaps we would have been spared some of these problems that we're living with today in terms of Enron, WorldCom, Global Crossing, you name it. The power of questionable corporate leaderships really has been unchecked. And to the extent that they can insinuate themselves into the highest levels of government, we're going to continue to have problems, and we're not going to be able, I guess at the clearest level, to be sure that we have a sound economy, because these companies are largely going to be propped up by the government, and that really defies a genuine market economy and a truthful way of appraising these companies and what they produce and what they do. Early in this investigation, when ADM had some concerns about what was happening, what the investigation was about, what the damage was, one of the first things they did was to call some of their contacts in the CIA in Europe. Most people in business don't know anybody in the CIA, much less agents that you can call by name at some international posting. So ADM is really plugged in. To the extent that there are murky institutions in Washington they could get access to, that's kind of consistent with their history. I don't think we'll ever know the full extent of that. These are arrangements that are made behind closed doors and pretty much at the highest levels. But what's troubling is that corporation that no one elected, that is not officially part of the government, could have so much influence over our elected officials, over our foreign policy, over our domestic policy, and over who gets elected. How that happened is something I tried to capture in my book because I think it's anti-democratic. I think it's important. But it's a complicated story. It's not a story that you're going to see on the evening news, and that it's not the kind of story that can be summarized in a 20-second soundbite. My hope is that people who care about democracy will start to think about the connections between some of these special interests and the people that they elect, and start monitoring them and asking them questions. I mean, I think a basic question that people should be asking their elected representatives is, do you take money from ADM? Do you take money from certain other companies that we've begun to ask questions about? If so, why? What did you give in return? If the questions can't be answered adequately, at a minimum, people should look at replacing those people.
Yo quisiera creer que esta lucha es por mí, por mi futuro, por mi felicidad. Yo sí que tenía fe y todo me lo creí, toda la poesía y toda la pasión. Sin esperanzas yo no puedo vivir, pan y un libro no me van a hacer feliz. Alzarme al vuelo es intrínseco para mí, vacúname rápido que mi libre albedrío hoy se escapa de aquí. Se canceló el porvenir y nadie quiso opinar en la tierra más libre de toda América. Con 1000 esperanzas soñé y 1000 sacrificios logré para entonces tenerte que al fin abandonar. Sin esperanzas yo no puedo vivir, pan y un libro no me van a hacer feliz. Alzarme al vuelo es intrínseco para mí, declárame escoria que mi balsa se llama el kikiriki. feliz. Alzarme al vuelo es intrínseco para mí. Declárame escoria que mi balsa se llama el kikiriki. Sin esperanzas no voy a vivir.
A friend of mine told me about the 60-minute program and that they were looking for a Cuban person to translate to Juan Miguel, and they pay me $80 an hour to go to the interview, and I was not really interested in what they were paying, but I was interested in participating in that because I wanted to see what was going on. The interview was conducted in the International Youth for Understanding in Washington, D.C., close to the cathedral. I talked to Dan Rather, and Dan Rather told me that the minute that he started talking to Juan Miguel in English, I have to start talking to Juan Miguel in Spanish. I have a microphone on my chair, and I have something sticking in my ear. The voice of Dan Rather enters through my ears, and then I have to start talking to Juan Miguel, and my voice enters to his ear. In the interview, you will see Juan Miguel and Dan Rather talking to each other. I am not in the program, and my voice doesn't come in the program because my voice goes into Juan Miguel's ears, and then when Juan Miguel starts talking in Spanish, then my friend starts translating into English, and his voice is the one that you were supposed to hear in the program. But what was very surprising to me at the end of the program is that Dan Rather say that the other translator, the one whose voice was supposed to be in the program, the one that was translated from Spanish to English, guy from Ecuador, and they say he was not very dramatic, that he was not putting enough emphasis or drama in the way he talks. So he took that translation to New York, and they hired in New York a dramatic actor, and they take the whole thing again. Whatever Juan Miguel have said, they put it with the voice of the actor to have really a dramatic show. In 60 minutes will be a dramatic show and show a lot of emotion. The first thing I noticed when I saw the 60 minutes is that the voice of my friend, the other translator, was not there. He was the actor. And then I saw the dramatism of the voice, how they have fixed that interview to really deceive the people and show the emotion that was not there and show the drama that was not there. To me, it was just a bunch of bull. I saw Juan Miguel when they arrived in the caravan. They come out of the car, and Greg Craig, the lawyer for Clinton, was with him, and Dan Rather was already in the building. And I saw Juan Miguel coming with his wife and baby, and being escorted by the lawyer. Also, they have some bodyguards or somebody from the Cuban intersection with them. It was no opportunity for candid talk. Juan Miguel and his wife was never alone. When we were there, the two bodyguards or whatever they were always there. The lawyer was always there. The lawyer for Clinton seemed very preoccupied with the kind of question that Dan Rather was going to ask Juan Miguel. During the interview, Greg Craig was looking through the glass to see how Dan Rather and Juan Miguel were doing. Dan Rather's attitude was very friendly with Juan Miguel and extremely friendly with Greg Craig. Every time that the program is stopped, Greg Craig went into the room where Juan Miguel was being interviewed, and now Juan Miguel is out and going into the bathroom or to have a drink of water. And then Greg Craig and And then rather we are talking to each other about the next question or about whatever. I couldn't hear what they were talking, but I saw them talking and changing papers and things like that. Greg Craig, during the tape, was to me, my impression was that he was directing Dan Rather what to do next. It is my opinion that Greg Craig was coaching Dan Rather. I didn't see anybody coaching Juan Miguel. I think Juan Miguel was under a lot of stress, and he was very careful in what he was saying and how he was answering the question. My impression was that he was a man being held hostage by the regime. His family was in Cuba, his mother and other relatives were in Cuba. I have talked to his uncle in one of the demonstrations in front of the intersection, and his uncle have assured me that Juan Miguel have all the intention to emigrate to United States, and he have told them, keep my son over there until I can make it over there. So my impression was that he was under stress and he couldn't do anything else but to play the game that Castro wanted him to play. I don't know for sure who wrote the question, but I see the lawyer Greg Craig passing papers to Dan Rather and telling him whatever. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw him, discussing the next hour of questioning. Dan Rather seemed very amenable to the coaching of Craig, and they seemed to be very friendly to each other. My impression of the taping that was being arranged, that the lawyer has been very specific about what he wants to be asked to Juan Miguel, and he wanted to have a good presentation in the show, because to me this was kind of a propaganda that they were putting together because they want to get Elian out of here, out of the United States, and they were trying to seek the American people opinion in their favor. My father was a newsman in Cuba, and it bothers me to see that a person like Dan Rather being coached by a lawyer for Clinton. So as a Cuban, as an American, and somebody that his father was a newsman, that bothers me tremendously. And I could assure anybody who wants to know that to me that was an arranged program. I am glad that I participate because that confirms to me something that I believe. This guy, the Greg Craig, the lawyer, was somebody that was hired, paying a lot of money to do something that Bill Clinton, for whatever reason, want to achieve. That's something that to me is sad. When I saw the interview on television, I didn't know if I wanted to throw up or cry. It was sad to see something like that on American television, and how people can be deceived by what they see and what they hear, not knowing the truth. So that's the reason I believe that interviews like this are very important, that somebody have the guts to come out and tell the truth and tell it like it is. Because I think the American people should know what is behind the scene, what really happened, and what kind of guy this Dan Rather is.